Sociopathy.
Can we define that?
Sure.
Just based on
So the more common term is a sociopath. So sociopathy is the condition of being a sociopath. Sociopaths are individuals that have very low capacity for empathy. They do not display normal love. They do not appear to experience remorse. They may experience regret. A person, if you back your car into something, you will feel regret whether you're a sociopath or not, because you have to deal with the aftermath. But if you run over somebody's pet, if you're normal, you will feel terrible at the pain you've caused, and if you're a sociopath, you may feel very little beyond annoyance.
Do you think that that's a disorder?
No, I think it makes very little sense to think of it as a disorder, and I'll tell you why. I mean, the first thing is the commonality of it. So it seems to be that somewhere between 1 and 4% of the population is sociopathic, and that's a very high number for a disorder. And it could be that you have something like lead in the water could cause 1 to 4% of the population to be mentally retarded in some recognizable way, but you wouldn't find it broadly distributed across an entire culture in this way. It's also true that we see sociopaths in many regards rising to the top of economic hierarchies and political hierarchies. So it's conspicuous that something that we have wanted to label as a disorder seems to be like a superpower for a certain number of people. So disorder is probably not the right category. I also think we draw too starkly the line between sociopaths and the rest of us. I think essentially all of us are sociopathic in some regards with respect to some things, and probably we have to be this way. So we will all recognize that we can hear about the suffering of a population that is remote from us, either in space or in time, and we can feel very little, even if in the abstract what is happening to that population is frightening or abhorrent to us. We may be able to hear about it and then go on about our day, go buy a coffee or whatever, where we could have had our lives pivot around the discovery that there were people suffering, and yet it only captures our attention momentarily. So that strikes me as the experience of being sociopathic, largely because the population that we're talking about is too far for us to do anything productive, and so it wouldn't make sense for us to feel the emotion deeply, because it would be disruptive of things that we actually do have influence over. I think it is also really important to grapple with the lesson, I would say, of something like an organized crime leader. An organized crime leader, if the narratives we have about these folks is right, may very well love their family passionately, and they may go very far out of their way to provide benefits and to protect their families from harm. And at the same time, they may be able to turn off their feelings of sympathy or empathy with people that they have to harm in order to engage in the criminal activity that they engage in. And so when we see somebody who is in a position of control in an organized crime network give an order that does harm to innocent people, we think this must be a sociopath. But that doesn't square with the definition of sociopath and with somebody who goes home to their family and has a normal familial relationship with them. I think this is a much richer landscape than we give it credit for, and we should think very carefully about the fact that people have a sociopathic capacity in order to function normally, so as not to be overwhelmed by the huge amount of suffering in the world, and so as not to be too focused on events or circumstances too far or too powerful to do anything about. And that when we refer to sociopaths, we're really talking about people who are obligate, who have no choice and no capacity to tap into the suffering of others when need be, and that is a special case. But there's no reason to think that just because it's at the far end of a continuum of, how tapped into other people's emotional states an individual is, that it is suddenly a disorder once you get to the end of the continuum. I would imagine in ancestral circumstances that there are cases in which effectively one might be of value to one's lineage in a form that couldn't be disrupted by observing suffering. Soldiers on a battlefield, for example, might be very effective if they could tune out the immense amount of suffering around them and do their job in a more or less mechanical fashion. So I do wonder if the truth of sociopaths is that in ancestral circumstances they would have been pointed outward so that their sociopathic tendencies would have been a benefit to their lineage because of what they could do to competing groups, and that what we are seeing, the reason we think of this as a disorder, is that people's sociopathic powers are turned chaotically, and some of them are turned, in close quarters against people who are part of the in-group and therefore are not supposed to be the target of this pattern, but that it really is an adaptation just deployed in a way that doesn't make any sense.
You're using these words sympathy and empathy. What do you mean by that?
Well, in this case, I've used them somewhat interchangeably because it requires some careful thought to see why they should be defined in the way they should be defined. But in a formal sense, sympathy is empathy with an extra characteristic. Empathy is, in my language, it is the capacity to feel the emotions of another by taking the data of their circumstances and running it through one's own mental architecture as if you were there. Sympathy, you do the same thing with the acknowledgement that you're effectively on the same team as the entity, the person, or the creature with whom you are sympathizing. So the example that I think makes this clear is we empathize with people to know what they're going to do because that provides advantages evolutionarily. That's true whether the person that you're empathizing with is your ally or your enemy. So it's very important, for example, to be able to empathize with Hitler in the bunker as the Allies approach, right? You can understand exactly why he puts a gun to his head and shoots himself because he knows what's coming. But you shouldn't sympathize with him. He was a monster and he deserves no sympathy whatsoever. So the empathy is a tool, it's a means to an end to discover what another individual is likely to do so that you can position yourself relative to that behavior. Sympathy is empathizing with somebody with whom you have allegiance, and therefore, one feels the pain of somebody on their team when that person has experienced a misfortune. Personally, one feels some fraction of that pain themselves. And so sympathy is the same pathos. You feel the same way. Whereas, in the case of your enemy, if you're empathizing with them, you may feel exactly the opposite with respect to what's happened. They may experience a misfortune and you may feel joy at the fact that they've screwed up. So you don't feel the same emotion. You understand, you feel the emotion that they feel, you correctly predict it, but your reaction to it may be very different. A sociopath who does very well may be very good at predicting the behavior and feelings of others without feeling them themselves. So they would lack sympathy, but they may be capable of empathizing. I think this is a place that we actually get sociopathy wrong. We imagine that they are incapable of empathy because there are certain places where they are a bit tone deaf. There are certain experiences in being a human being that are not usually described very well, and so a sociopath may have a hard time picking up what it really would be like to have that emotional experience. So things surrounding love and grief and things like that may be a bit hard for them to put their fingers on, but in general they may be very attuned to what somebody's psychological state is, because somebody else's psychological state may constitute an opportunity or a hazard to them, and being aware of it is useful, even just mechanically.
So their empathy only extends to the point where usefulness ends?
Well, actually, I would say it a little differently. I would say the empathy that I see sociopaths being best at is learning the lessons of emotional states that are visible. And to the extent that an emotional state is difficult to see into. I mean, think of how confusing profound grief is. Profound grief is just the most remarkably complex state where, at one moment you're, completely lost in despair, and then 10 minutes later you're doing something productive and you're not thinking about the loss. And so that oscillation has to be bewildering if you've never experienced, because it seems like, being productive, it puts the lie to the fact that you were debilitated only moments ago. And, only if you've experienced that and you know how real it is to oscillate between being focused on this terrible loss and being in another mindset, doing something else and not thinking about it. Only if you've done that do you realize that transition is even possible, let alone the common experience of grief. So, when a sociopath sees this, not having felt the despair at the loss of somebody that they loved, I think they think we're playing or something, or that maybe that's the evidence that we're not really as despairing as we appear to be in that phase or something. So anyway, it can be very revealing when you get to those few places in life where it's rare to see a really good description of the experience. Those are places that a sociopath would have a very difficult time simulating the experience, because nothing has described what it's really like. I suspect we can do a brilliant job with sociopathy, but that we can't deploy the solution on a population that's already gone through development and hope to be very effective with it. That what we would need to do is understand what the frame of mind of somebody is as they switch between their sociopathic and their empathic mode, and then train that switch so that it is tuned to the realities of life. And I would say, with respect to the obligate sociopath, that ideally a civilization that functions should provide no profit to an individual for externalizing harm onto other people. And if you actually took that seriously, such that there was no opportunity to get ahead by hurting people, then a sociopath would not find opportunities that the rest of us find troubling. They would be corralled into behaviors that were at least not harmful. And so they might be harder to recognize, because their motivations for doing something might be different from what another person might be motivated by. But the behavior that resulted might be very similar, because there would be no profit in harming people and walking away without feeling bad about it. Building systems that don't reward that behavior ought to be a focus at every scale. The price that we pay at every scale for people's betrayals of each other is very, very high. And frankly, if you want civilization to function well, you want it to produce the stuff of well-being at the highest rate possible, so that everybody has the experience of living in an abundant world. And that takes a good bit of engineering to make that a stable state, so that people don't capture more than their share of the well-being and turn it into machinery of power. I think we should use developmental environments to increase the degree to which we sympathize with each other. In other words, I think we have inherited from our ancestors a capacity for sympathy that is too narrow, and that it is very important that we be able, for example, to sympathize with generations yet unborn, because we, unlike our ancestors, have the power to destroy their environment. So in some sense, we need to be able to feel the harm that we do to people 10, 12 generations down the road in order to protect them adequately from us. Our tools are such that we can wreck civilization in a single generation, and so the degree to which this needs to be emphasized is greater than any ancestral group will likely have intuited, but that's where we are. And so in some sense we have to alter the developmental landscape, not only to be healthy, but to be modified for the new realities that being a modern human being has handed us. People who have no capacity to tap into the emotions of others are obviously a special hazard, and we need to watch out for it. But I think the story of human variation is a rich and sometimes a difficult story, and that the desire to do away with dyslexics or people who have other kinds of neurological diversity is a mistake. So anyway, I would be hesitant to say that we should do anything extreme with respect to people on a continuum, but we do want to rule out the behaviors in which people get ahead by producing harm for others. At the same time, learning what developmental experiences cause a person to become compassionate is probably something we should know, and as soon as we know what makes people compassionate, I would love to see it induced in more people at a greater level.
There we go.
All right. Hold on. I may need to kill this
Oh, that
mosquito.
wasn't a sound test.
No, that was a mosquito test. And it passed, unfortunately. Yes!
Are mosquitoes, would you call them
Sociopath? No, they're chronic empaths, and they're just trying to tap into your inner essence. Yeah, the feels are incredible.